I never thought my life would shatter over appetizers at an Italian restaurant. But that's how it happened between the calamari and the Caesar salad. My parents destroyed what little faith I had left in them. The evening had started so well. Lucas, my brilliant, quietly determined son, had graduated high school that morning summa cum laude, Stanford bound, the full-ride scholarship still feeling like a dream we might wake from. I'd spent weeks planning this dinner at Vincenzo's, the upscale Italian place my parents loved. I wanted everything to be perfect, even though a part of me knew better than to expect perfection when Eleanor and Howard Whitman were involved. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble, Sophia," my mother said as she settled into her seat, smoothing her immaculate gray bob. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light as she reached for her water glass. "Though I suppose it is a special occasion." My husband Robert squeezed my hand under the table. After 20 years together, he could sense my tension with a touch. "Lucas deserves it," I said, watching my son scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the undercurrents at the table. My daughter Madison, 15 and already too perceptive for her own good, was sketching on her napkin, but I knew she was listening to every word. My sister Diane arrived last, as usual. Perfectly put together in her designer dress, not a strand of her highlighted hair out of place. The successful surgeon. The golden child. "Sorry I'm late," she said, kissing our mother's cheek before taking her seat. "Emergency consult." "Of course, darling," my mother said, her voice warming in a way it never did for me. "Your work saves lives." I saw Madison roll her eyes and felt a flash of guilt. I shouldn't let my children see my resentment. We ordered drinks. Made small talk about the graduation ceremony. My father complained about the length of the valedictorian speech. My mother criticized the principal's suit. The familiar symphony of disapproval that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. Then, just as the waiter set down our appetizers, my mother tapped her wine glass with her fork. The crystal rang out, silencing us all. "Before we start eating, Howard and I have a special announcement," she said, her smile tight and practiced. The smile that never reached her eyes. The smile that always preceded something terrible. My stomach twisted. Robert's hand found mine again. "As you all know," my mother continued, "Lucas has always been exceptionally bright. Stanford is quite the achievement." My father nodded, his face stern as always. "Which is why we've made an important financial decision." In that moment, I saw the train coming. I just couldn't move off the tracks. The trust fund we established when Lucas was born, we've decided to redirect those funds to establish a foundation in Diane's name instead. Time stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat. Could feel the blood draining from my face. "The Diane Reynolds Medical Research Foundation will fund promising scientists in women's health," my mother continued, her voice smooth as poisoned honey. "It's the perfect tribute to Diane's work as a surgeon." I looked at my sister. She seemed surprised, but there was something else in her expression. Pride. Pleasure. Acceptance of what was rightfully hers. That's when the rage I'd suppressed for decades began to rise like floodwater against a crumbling dam. "You're taking Lucas's college fund to create a vanity project for Diane?" The words escaped before I could stop them, quiet but razor-sharp. My mother's smile faltered. "It's hardly a vanity project, Sophia. Your sister saves lives every day. This foundation will help thousands of women." I noticed she didn't deny taking Lucas's money. "So my son's education means nothing compared to burnishing Diane's already sterling reputation?" My voice was rising now. Other diners were starting to look our way. Robert, always my anchor in these storms, chuckled softly. A sound so incongruous it made everyone turn to him. "That's funny, Eleanor," he said, taking a calm sip of his beer. "Because we moved that money 6 months ago." My father's head snapped up like a predator spotting movement. "You did what?" "When you started asking all those questions about Lucas's fund last Christmas, we figured something was up. So we moved it into a new account." Robert's voice remained even reasonable. Call it an insurance policy. The mask slipped then. My mother's face contorted, her carefully maintained composure cracking like thin ice. That money was a gift from us. You had no right. I found my voice again, stronger this time. No right? You set up that fund for Lucas's education. You can't just change your mind 18 years later because Diane finally did something you approve of. Don't drag me into this, Sophia, my sister said, defensive. I didn't know anything about it, but there was something in her eyes. A flicker of doubt. My father leaned forward, his gray eyes cold as slate. The fund was established with our money under our control. You've committed theft. Lucas stood up so suddenly his chair nearly toppled. I don't want anything from either of you. My mother reached for his arm. Sit down, Lucas. This is between the adults. I'm 18, he said, pulling away from her. And this is about my future. Robert's voice remained steady, a counterpoint to the chaos. Lucas has a full scholarship to Stanford. He doesn't need your money. He never did. I saw Madison pulling out her phone, angling it toward my parents. Always the documentarian. Turn that off immediately, young lady, my father barked, pointing a finger that had intimidated board members and business rivals alike. But my daughter, who had grown up watching these dynamics play out, just stared back coolly. Public place. Free country. Something inside me surged with pride, even as another part filled with shame. My children shouldn't have to witness this, shouldn't have to defend themselves against their own grandparents. We're leaving. I stood up, gathering my purse. Madison, Lucas, let's go. My mother's voice stopped me, that voice that had dictated so much of my life. If you walk out of here, you'll regret it. I promise you that. I turned back to look at her, really look at her. The perfect hair. The expensive clothes. The coldness in her eyes that had always made me feel small. Is that a threat, Mother? It's a guarantee. Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. We stared at each other across the ruins of what should have been a celebration. In her eyes, I saw something I'd never fully acknowledged before. She didn't love me. Maybe she never had. Goodbye, Mother. I turned and walked away, my family following. As we left, I caught a glimpse of Diane's face. For just a moment, I saw something unexpected there. Doubt. Maybe even envy. I didn't know then how significant that look would become. The first attack came 3 days later. I was grading papers at our kitchen island, trying to lose myself in my students' interpretations of Jane Austen when the email notification pinged. From Whitcrest Bank. Subject: Account freeze notice. My hands trembled as I read. They'd frozen Lucas's college fund, claiming it was established as an irrevocable gift trust with them as trustees. The bank had put a temporary hold pending legal review. They've frozen Lucas's college fund, I told Robert when he walked in, my voice hollow. What? How? He set down his briefcase, his forehead creasing with concern. They're claiming it was established as an irrevocable gift trust with them as trustees. That's not what they told us when they set it up. He came to look over my shoulder at the email. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course not. But Mother always has perfect paperwork. Years of my mother's voice echoed in my head. Always read the fine print, Sophia. Though I suppose attention to detail was never your strong suit, was it? My phone vibrated against the counter, Diane's name flashing on the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I answered anyway. Some childhood habits die hard. What do you want? My voice was colder than I intended. Mom and Dad said you stole money from them. Her voice came through on speaker. They're devastated, Sophia. The familiar feeling washed over me, being cast as the villain in the family narrative. That's not what happened, and you know it. All I know is they were trying to do something good, and you turned it into a war. Her voice had that familiar edge of superiority. Just like always. Those 3 words ignited something in me. Just like always? When have I ever been the one to start a fight? "You've always been jealous," she said, her voice rising. "Even back in high school, you couldn't stand that I was valedictorian." I didn't care about being valedictorian. The words burst out of me, carrying decades of hurt. I cared that they skipped my graduation to go to your award ceremony. Robert took the phone from my shaking hand. "Diane, unless you're calling to help, we're done here." He hung up, and I collapsed against him, the tears finally coming. Lucas worked so hard. He deserves Stanford. Robert held me tight, his heartbeat steady against my ear. "He'll go to Stanford. I'll make sure of it." What I didn't know then was that my parents were just getting started. I've always found peace in my classroom at Westfield Community College. There's something about the worn desks, the smell of books, the eager faces of students discovering literature for the first time that centers me. Teaching was never the prestigious career my parents wanted for me, not like Diane's surgical practice, but it was mine. My sanctuary. Until they took that too. "Professor Lawson speaking." I answered my office phone, distracted by the essay I was grading. "Sophia, could you come to my office?" Dean Harris's voice was strained. "There's a situation we need to discuss." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. I'd known Charles Harris for 8 years. He'd never sounded like that before. I found him behind his desk, looking uncomfortable. He gestured for me to sit. "Sophia, I've received some concerning information." He wouldn't meet my eyes. "There's an allegation that you've been inappropriately helping students with their essays." The room seemed to tilt. "What? That's absurd. We've received emails containing examples of your personal writing alongside student papers with similar content." Cold realization washed over me. "May I see these emails?" He turned his monitor toward me. The sender was listed as anonymous, but I recognized the text immediately. Paragraphs from my unpublished novel manuscript, the one I'd been working on for years, paired with student essays that shared similar themes or phrases. Taken out of context, twisted to look damning. "Dean Harris, someone is trying to sabotage me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Those are from a novel I've been writing. Only family members have seen it." The drive home was a blur. Rain had started falling, mirroring the storm inside me. I called Robert, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mother sent my novel excerpts to the dean, claiming I helped students cheat. "How?" Robert's shock came through clearly. "We never shared your manuscript with her." Then it hit me like a physical blow. "Diane. She's the only one who has a copy." The memory surfaced. Diane's unexpected interest in my writing last year, her request to read the manuscript I'd been guarding so carefully. "I want to understand what matters to you, Sophia. We're sisters, after all." I hung up and immediately called her. "How could you give Mom my manuscript?" I demanded when she answered. "She said she wanted to read it." Diane sounded defensive. "I thought she was finally taking an interest in your work. She used it to try to get me fired." Silence on the line. "Then what?" "No, that can't be right. Wake up, Diane. She's using you against me, just like she always has." More silence, this one different. I could almost hear her thoughts racing. "I'll call you back," she finally said, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. I sat in my parked car in our driveway, rain drumming on the roof, and let myself feel it all. The betrayal. The rage. The bone-deep weariness of fighting the same battle year after year. I thought of Lucas, who had worked so hard to earn his place at Stanford. Of Madison, who watched and absorbed everything, learning from the dysfunction around her. Of Robert, steady and loyal, who had married into this mess and never complained. And I thought about the novel on my laptop, the story I'd poured my heart into, the characters who felt more real to me than my own family sometimes. Words that were mine, used as weapons against me. Enough, I thought as lightning flashed across the sky. This ends now. I didn't know yet how to end it, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't be the only one scarred when this war was over. The knock came as darkness fell. 3 sharp raps, hesitant yet insistent. I opened the door to find Diane standing on my porch, soaked from the rain. Her perfect hair hung in wet strands, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. She looked nothing like the polished surgeon who had always made me feel shabby in comparison. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice small. I stepped aside without a word. Water pooled around her expensive shoes on my entryway floor. "I confronted Mom," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. She didn't even deny it. She said she was making things even. "Welcome to my entire childhood," I replied, the bitterness so familiar it tasted like an old friend. Diane sank onto our couch, looking suddenly exhausted. "I found something else. When I was at their house, I saw paperwork for the foundation." She pulled a folded document from her purse. "It's not a medical research foundation at all. It's a family trust with Mom, Dad, and me as beneficiaries." I wasn't surprised. "Not really. Of course it is." She met my eyes then, a rare moment of genuine connection between us. "I didn't know. I swear. But you weren't exactly refusing the money, were you?" I couldn't help the accusation in my voice. Diane's face hardened. "I've worked hard for everything I have. Medical school paid for by them. Down payment on your house from them." The words tumbled out, years of resentment breaking free. "The perfect daughter with the perfect career that they wanted for you. You think it's been easy," she shouted, standing up. "The expectations? The constant pressure? While you got to run off and marry Robert and have babies and write your little stories." Little stories. The familiar dismissal sparked fresh anger, but something in her face stopped me. I really looked at my sister, then the shadows under her eyes, the fine lines etched by years of stress, the slight tremble in her hands. For the first time, I wondered if being the favorite child had been its own kind of prison. "They pitted us against each other our whole lives," I said, softer now. Diane's shoulders sagged, "and we let them." The silence that followed felt different, charged with possibility rather than resentment. "When we were kids," Diane said, her voice distant, "do you remember that summer at Lake Champlain? When we built that raft together?" I did remember. We'd worked on it for days, gathering driftwood, arguing over the design, finally launching it with shared triumph. Before competitions and comparisons had poisoned everything. "It sank after about 10 minutes," I said, a reluctant smile tugging at my lips. "But we built it together." Diane looked up, something fierce in her eyes. "Mom and Dad took so much from both of us, Sophia. They took my choice about my career. They took your confidence. They took our relationship." She stood straighter, suddenly reminding me of the determined little girl who had insisted we could build a raft that would float. "I want to help get Lucas's money back." I studied her face, looking for the trap, the hidden agenda. "Why?" I asked finally. "Why now?" "Because I'm tired of being their puppet." Her voice broke slightly. "And because he's my nephew, and he deserves better than what they did to us." For the first time in decades, I felt like I was seeing my sister, really seeing her. Not the competitor. Not the favorite. Just Diane. "Okay," I said. "Let's take them down." Attorney Patricia Michaels didn't look like someone who went to war for a living. With her silver bob and grandmother's pearls, she resembled someone who might offer you tea and homemade cookies. But behind her warm smile lay a legal mind that had made corporate giants tremble. She listened intently as we laid out the situation, taking occasional notes in a leather-bound notebook. "So let me get this straight," she said when we finished. "Your parents established this fund when Lucas was born, told you it was for his education, but secretly structured it as a trust they controlled?" "Yes," I confirmed, the familiar anger simmering. "And now, Ms. Reynolds, you're saying you've discovered they've been hiding significant assets in offshore accounts?" Diane nodded, sliding a folder across the desk. "For at least a decade. I found the statements when I was looking for the foundation paperwork." Patricia opened the folder, her eyebrows rising slightly as she scanned the contents. The Cayman Islands. Very traditional. She looked up, a gleam in her eye. Tax evasion would give us significant leverage. My stomach twisted. We don't want to get them arrested. We just want Lucas's money. Speak for yourself, Diane said, her voice hard. I turned to her in surprise. They used me my entire life, she continued, meeting my gaze. They manipulated me into being their spy against my own sister. She looked back at Patricia. They're not going to do the same to Lucas. I studied my sister's profile, the determined set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. This wasn't the Diane who had always sought our parents' approval. This was someone new. Someone stronger. What's our next move? I asked Patricia. A meeting, she said, closing the folder with practiced precision. On your terms, not theirs. We'll present them with a choice. Release the educational fund to Lucas immediately, or face exposure of their financial indiscretions. They won't give in easily, I warned. Patricia's smile was serene, but her eyes were steel. They've never faced me before. As we walked to our cars afterward, Diane paused. Are you sure about this? Once we go down this road. I thought about my son, whose hard work deserved recognition, not manipulation. About my daughter, watching and learning from every move we made. About the decades of calculated cruelty disguised as parental concern. I've spent my whole life being afraid of them, I said. Of disappointing them. Of making them angry. And for what? They were never going to love me the way I needed them to. The realization should have hurt more, but instead it felt like setting down a heavy burden I'd carried too long. I'm not afraid anymore, I said, and meant it. Diane nodded slowly. All those years, I thought you had it easier. No expectations. No pressure to be perfect. And I thought you had everything, I admitted. Their love. Their support. Their pride. I had their approval when I did exactly what they wanted, Diane corrected. That's not the same thing as love. We stood there in the parking lot, two women in our 40s, finally seeing the full picture of our shared childhood from both sides. We deserved better, I said softly. Yes, Diane agreed. We did. My parents' house had always reminded me of an elaborate stage set. Everything perfect, positioned for maximum effect, but somehow hollow at its core. The white sofas no one was allowed to sit on as children. The crystal vases filled with fresh flowers every 3 days. The mahogany grandfather clock that had once been my timekeeper, don't be late for dinner, Sophia, you know how your father hates tardiness, still ticking away in the corner, marking the cadence of a life I had escaped. They sat rigidly on those pristine sofas as we entered, my mother in a cashmere sweater set, my father in his customary blazer. Their faces were carefully composed, but I could see the fury simmering beneath. Patricia Michaels walked in behind us, projecting calm confidence. This is outrageous, my father said immediately, not bothering with greetings. You bring a lawyer to a family discussion? Patricia smiled pleasantly. Given the nature of your actions against my clients, it seemed prudent. What actions? My mother waved a dismissive hand. We simply changed our minds about a gift. Patricia opened her briefcase. Mrs. Whitman, we have evidence of tax evasion through offshore accounts in the Caymans. We also have documentation of your attempts to interfere with Professor Lawson's employment. My mother's composure slipped for a microsecond, a flash of something like fear crossing her face before she regained control. But her eyes went immediately to Diane. You ungrateful child, she hissed. After everything we've done for you. Diane didn't flinch. You didn't do anything for me. You did it for yourselves, to have something to brag about at the country club. My father turned to me, his face flushing with anger. This is your doing. You've always been jealous of your sister's success. The old accusation, the familiar pain. But this time, something was different. This time, I saw it clearly for what it was, a weapon designed to control me, to keep me small and manageable. No, Dad, I said calmly. I've been sad about the parents I never really had. Always so dramatic, my mother scoffed, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. Patricia laid out the terms with clinical precision. The educational fund will be released to Lucas immediately. You will sign this agreement not to contact Professor Lawson, her husband, or their children again. In return, we won't provide evidence of your financial improprieties to the IRS. This is blackmail. My father slammed his fist on the coffee table, rattling the teacups. Patricia didn't even blink. I prefer to call it a family settlement. My parents exchanged glances, a silent communication honed over decades of marriage. I wondered, not for the first time, if they had ever truly loved each other, or if their relationship had been another transaction, another performance. Fine, my mother said finally, her voice like ice. We'll sign. But understand this, you are no longer our daughters. You are no longer part of this family. The words should have devastated me. Instead, they felt like release. Diane stood up, straightening to her full height. For the first time in my life, that actually sounds like good news. As Patricia guided them through the signing process, I let my eyes wander around the room, the family photos where Diane featured prominently while I was often at the edges, the awards and certificates celebrating her achievements, the oil painting of my mother as a young woman that had always hung above the fireplace. I had once longed to be at the center of this world. Now I saw it for what it was, a beautiful, poisonous illusion. When it was done, we walked out without looking back. The spring air felt clean and new in my lungs. Beside me, Diane was quiet, lost in her own thoughts. Are you okay? I asked as we reached our cars. She looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in our adult lives. I don't know, but I think I will be. I nodded, understanding completely. Me too. As we drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the house growing smaller behind us. The perfect house. The perfect family. The perfect lie. It was finally over. Or so I thought. A year passed. Lucas thrived at Stanford, throwing himself into physics and philosophy with equal passion. Madison continued her quiet observation of the world, her art growing more confident and insightful. Robert and I settled into a peace we hadn't known was possible, the constant shadow of my parents' judgment finally lifted from our lives. And Diane. Diane changed. She cut back her surgical hours, started volunteering at a women's clinic, called me weekly just to talk, showed up for Madison's art show and Lucas's visit home. Slowly, cautiously, we built something new between us, not the closeness we might have had without our parents' interference, but something honest at least. When spring came again, I planned a small gathering for Lucas's return from freshman year, just family, a simple celebration in our backyard. Fairy lights in the trees, a homemade cake, the kind of gathering that would have seemed hopelessly mundane to my mother. I still can't believe Lucas finished his freshman year with a 4.0, I said to Diane as we hung lights together. She smiled, passing me another strand. Of course he did. He's brilliant. Though I think dating that physics TA might have helped with the quantum mechanics grade. We laughed easily, the sound still somewhat unfamiliar between us. Madison appeared from the house with more decorations. Lucas just texted. He's 10 minutes away. Robert emerged from the kitchen, carrying the cake I'd baked that morning. Just in time. Diane's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, her expression changing as she read the screen. What is it? I asked, immediately alert to the shift in her demeanor. An email from Dad's lawyer. Her voice was carefully neutral. He's had a stroke. The world seemed to still. The fairy lights blurred slightly before my eyes. Despite everything, despite the hurt and betrayal, despite the years of emotional manipulation, the news hit me like a physical blow. Is it serious? I asked quietly. It says he's asking for us. We looked at each other, a world of hurt and history between us. I thought of all the times I had sought his approval, his attention, his love. All the times I had come up empty. He's asking for us. Not demanding. Not commanding. Asking, "What do you think?" Diane's question hung in the air between us. I thought about it, really thought about it. I think. I think we decide together this time. Madison moved between us, putting her arms around both our waists. My wise, perceptive daughter. Family isn't who you're born to, she said softly. It's who stands by you. Diane's eyes met mine over Madison's head, and I saw my own conflict reflected there. The pull of the past. The possibility of a different future. The open question of whether forgiveness was possible or even desirable. Lucas's car pulled into the driveway, breaking the moment. "We'll talk about it later," I said to Diane. "Today is for celebrating." As we moved to greet Lucas, I felt something shift inside me, not a resolution, but a realization. Whatever we decided about my father, we would decide it together as sisters. Not as competitors. Not as pawns in someone else's game. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real inheritance, the freedom to choose our own path forward together.